couple more seconds.
Okay, it's now being streamed on live on YouTube. So welcome everybody to Parallax podcast. We're here with Thomas Hamelryck, Alexander Bard, Cadell Last, a bunch of hardcore philosophers, and I'm just going to ask them a bunch of questions and butt in occasionally. We're here to talk about metaphysical totality, and I'm a little confused about what that means. And so I guess we're going to be talking about metaphysics, East and West, event and process, mobilism and internalism. We have all kinds of big ass words here. So I'd like these guys to unpack those words and just tell everybody on YouTube and wherever, whoever's listening to this, what we're here to talk about. Maybe you could begin, Cadell, for.
Sure. Well, let's break down the concepts of metaphysics and totality first. So these are just concepts that you can Google. Just put in the concepts metaphysics or I'm not sure if totality will come up, but if you just put in the concept metaphysics, this definition will come up. And it's just a branch of philosophy that is really dealing with not physics, but how we conceptualize being. It's metaphysics. It's sort of a step back in sort of thinking about how we conceptualize, how we use categories. I think we often can fall into the trap of forgetting the very processes by which we start to conceptualize things and we start to identify with the concepts we have, the conceptual schemas we have. And it can be an extremely powerful tool to have a well-defined set of concepts. And it can also be blinding to have a very well-defined set of concepts. And a point actually that I've just come across in a paper by Freud that I've been teaching is he sort of emphasizes that whenever a new discipline comes into being, it's always conceptually messy. So you never start a way of thinking. You never start a discipline, of course, with a well-defined set of concepts. A well-defined set of concepts is something that comes into being through observing phenomena, making connections, making correlations, trying to make sense. And of course, like one of the buzzwords of our current intellectual community is sense-making crisis. So in some sense, the idea of a sense-making crisis is a crisis of metaphysics, because it's saying we don't know how to conceptualize what's going on. We don't have a well-defined set of concepts to make sense of the relations and to make sense of being.
Right.
And so when we think, to connect that, when we think totality, we're thinking about the whole of being. And it's very difficult to think of metaphysical totality today, in part because there is a tendency towards deconstruction. There is a tendency towards thinking in terms of multiplicities, a tendency towards thinking in terms of the many instead of the one, to use old philosophical terminology.
So are we engaged here,
Cadell,
in constructing a grand narrative or what?
I wouldn't say that we're trying to construct a grand narrative, but I would sort of use sort of what I've said here about metaphysics and totality and as sort of like at least how I understand what we're here to talk about. I could go on further about what I think we will end up talking about, but I'll pass it on to either Bard or Hamelryck to maybe answer that question, because Bard might be the best person to talk about narratology and grand narratives and this type of thing.
Okay. Well, I just thought that if we're talking about a metaphysical totality, we want a complete or total view that might have something to do with.
I can add in relation, the place of the grand narrative does have a unique, it has a unique, it's uniquely problematic when we try to think metaphysical totality, because one of the defining qualities of modernism is that you'd have one grand narrative. So like, for example, if I'm a Marxist, I have one narrative that kind of structures the way I view totality. That's just a simple example. I think we all kind of know what that narrative looks like. You'd have a primitive communism, and then you'd have several developmental stages of modes of production, which are what Marx would define as the historical process. And then you would have that pointing towards world communism. And so you'd have a narrative between a fall from primitive communism and a sort of a return to a type of higher level world communism. That would be an example of a grand narrative. And then you'd have, like, just to give another quick example of someone like one of the founding postmodern thinkers, I don't know his first name, but his last name's Lyotard. He wrote a paper about sort of the end of grand narratives. And he's not necessarily saying that, grand narratives are bad, so much as he's saying postmodern subjectivity is kind of spontaneously skeptical of grand narratives. It's kind of like a feature of postmodern subjectivity. And I have to say, like, in myself, whenever someone comes along with their grand narrative presenting an ontology to me, I just get, like, I do have a spontaneous, get out of here. Like, I do think it's annoying, and I do think it stops thinking, because the grand narrative, it doesn't leave room for gaps. It doesn't leave room for uncertainty. It doesn't leave room for chaos. It doesn't leave room for the unknown. So I like to keep that inside my conceptualization, and that's why, for me, any narrative that I have about my being is never, like, complete in a sort of a naive sense, like, oh, this is the one,
Okay, well, Alexander's writing a trilogy called the Grand Narrative Trilogy. No, isn't that how your trilogy is called? So what are we trying to achieve here, Alexander? And can you defend that term in some way, since you're using it?
Oh, absolutely. And absolute, I believe in Hegel's absolute knowing. What that means is that there's actually very little that we can say about things. It turns out, well, what human beings do is that we use metaphors all the time and analogies. And we think just because we say something about biology, it must also be applicable on physics. And if we say something about physics, it must be applicable on mind. And it isn't. That's the thing. I'm working on transcendental emergentism with Alexander Vrede Elung from Denmark and with Jan Söderqvist, my co-writer for Pros and Event, the book I'm working on at the moment. And this is basically a metaphysical system that is as far as we can take metaphysics without going overboard, which people constantly do. My main argument against people doing metaphysics is that, oh yeah, sounds nice. You can apply that on a lot of things, except you have an axiom here, a creator God who exists before creation, which is the most common mistake people make all the time. They get stuck with the fucking creator God who just programmed the universe in a certain way. So therefore, you can use metaphors all over the place. That's called general emergence theory. And that's not becoming like the worst thing I could ever think of, a general emergence theory. Like there could be general theory on how something can emerge. There isn't. When something ever emerges, according to Hegel, the entire history of emergences has to be rewritten, because the very condition for the concept of emergence changes when something new emerges. We must be very humble before we start doing metaphysics. And I think that's the lesson to be learned from the 20th century, is that we must have grand narratives. And as Hegel would say, if we don't have a grand narrative, then not having one is the grand narrative. And that's total nihilism. So at the end of the day, the postmodernists had to react against modernism, and they had to react against certain ambitions and things, but they also misunderstood and misread guys like Hegel. And that's, for example, why going back to Hegel and Nietzsche is what we need to do again. The interesting thing today, again, is the dialectical relation between Hegel and Nietzsche. And they're both right, but they're right in very different ways. They're like parallaxes onto the same thing they're studying, which is metaphysics. So what I was enthusiastic about today about this conversation is that I've had wonderful conversations in the past with Sweeny and Hamelryck on Tantra versus Sutra and the need for Tantra versus Sutra in our culture today. It has to be imported from the East to the West. It has to be applied on everything we do. Nothing today can be credible. Nothing in metaphysics, nothing in ethics, nothing in phenomenology or epistemology can be credible today unless you apply both a tantric and a sutric worldview onto it. Both of them, right? The other thing is that Cadel and I are about to write a book that we call Absolute Negativity, where we study negation or negativity in relation to oscillation. But we start with negativity as first principle. So we're basically building, what I'm doing with Jan Söderqvist is that I'm building a dialectics between Hegelian negation and Nietzschean oscillation. Then I'm looking into those two things. I'm going to work with that with Cadell on the book, Absolute Negativity, while I'm also working on process and event with Jan Söderqvist. So basically, at the center of the process and event project, there's a first dialectics, a principle of first dialectics, which is the dialectics between negation and oscillation. And I think it's wonderful here that I can both develop the book with Cadell and give credit to anybody who deserves it in the process, which is anybody of you guys here today, not just Andrew and Thomas, and see how we can take that. But I think there's a deep, deep, deep connection between the separation of Sutra and Tantra and the principle of the Barred Absolute. What can be known and what can be presented are different things. Okay? Not everything that's known is necessarily public. I like the idea of sacred knowledge, as you know. But the Barred Absolute and Tantra Sutra is one thing. Like, you can only know that which you're prepared towards knowing. Otherwise, you cannot know it yet. That's where Hegel and Tantra meet. But I'm also thinking this could be really inspiring for me and Cadell, this conversation tonight, because we're very enthusiastic about writing our book. So I want to start that conversation by saying that if we think of negation and oscillation as a fundamental first dialectic, which is really hard to think, but just assume that could be applied potentially on several different emergence vectors or emergences in metaphysics, then it's fundamental and therefore interesting. But if you apply that, there's a shadow to both of them. And the shadow to negation is death. And the shadow to oscillation is chaos or contingency. And it turns out that these two things, death and contingency, are the two things human beings cannot handle. And they try to escape death and they try to escape contingency constantly, all the time. The Bible starts with, in the beginning there was chaos. That was chaos before God existed. Then God came into being and God created order in the chaos. We're dreaming about order so much. And we're also dreaming about life so much that we're terrified of death. And constantly, all the metaphysical systems that we developed over the last 10,000 years have lacked in these two departments, either at least one of them, or usually both. People are terrified of death and they're terrified of contingency, and therefore they come up with the wildest possible fantasies to try to escape these two things, which are the shadows of negation and oscillation. I think that could be a really interesting topic for tonight's conversation.
Okay, let's move it over to Thomas. So can you reflect on what you've heard so far? You need to unmute yourself. Ask to unmute.
We can't, or I had a trouble unmuting myself. I don't know if Thomas can unmute himself. He can't.
Okay, now I can. No, the
so we have to
host
ask you to
allowed
unmute
me
yourself.
To
That's
unmute myself. That's
okay.
That's
Don't just keep yourself unmuted for the whole.
All right. I I kind of feel a bit like a cat in a bowling game. I'm not a philosopher, and I've already heard a lot of words and concepts that I don't really know what to make of them. So the first thing that comes to mind is what are we doing here actually? Are we doing philosophical anthropology, like for example Girard, or are we doing hardcore metaphysics like Whitehead? I mean, these are, in my book, very different things, and it seems that we have a conflation of the two. So what is this metaphysics that you're after? Do you want to include things like quantum mechanics and relativity and the structure of the universe, or do you want to understand how humans work, or is your ambition to actually do both, to span both of these things? And yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. These are very interesting topics, but I think it's good to start with discussing the scope of what we're going to discuss here, right? What are we going to discuss tonight, basically?
Yeah, and some of the things that we're talking about tonight are on the back of our recent conversation to do with religion as well. So how does religion fit in all this?
The religious aspect of it. So a lot of the stuff that I hear, like, there's the negation of the oscillation, and the shadow of negation is death. I mean, to me, that's just pure theology, right? I mean, that's just scripture. I mean, I have nothing against it, but so we have like the question here, like, are we going to do metaphysics? Are we going to do philosophical anthropology? Are we developing new types of religious scripture, or all three of them, or neither of them?
Can I pass on that one? So metaphysics is huge. And I would like to concentrate on the stories we tell each other in that sense. It's metaphysics closer to religion. Therefore, it's also closer to social phenomena like lynch mobbing. And therefore, I think it ties into what Thomas usually deals with, which is, for example, Girardian understandings of society. So I would propose then that where negation and oscillation fit into this is also called process and event. So either you assume, as human beings originally did, that everything is the eternal return of the same. The seasons are the same. After winter comes spring. After spring comes summer. After summer comes fall. And even though there's a new year, it's just the same year all over again. Everything is being repeated. We die and we give birth, and we die and we give birth, and it's just the same thing all over again. Now that is the religion. If we assume there's a religion tied to that, if that's the only worldview we have, we can call that nomadology, because it was obviously the religion of people who were nomadic. So until we settled permanently, we had no other idea except the eternal return of the same. That's fundamental to anthropology, right? And that we call paganism as well. But then comes a revolution some 3,700 years ago, starting in Persia, which we eventually built the West on. And this was the idea that an event can happen. Kat and I will argue that it's probably the realization that death is absolute. And when death happens, it leaves space for something else to occur instead. It's called, there's first a non-event or an anti-event, and then comes the event. But we can leave that aside if we don't want to go into that tonight. But there's the event. And with event comes the idea that something can happen that changes history forever. This is fundamental to Christianity. This is fundamental to Islam. It's fundamental to Zoroastrianism and Judaism. All the four major religions that come out of the West that eventually established the Middle East and Europe, which we call the West, are built on eventologies. And the trick, though, is this one. If you just go with eventology, once the eventology has occurred, which is an event, an historical event in itself, it didn't happen in Persia like out of nowhere. It affected China, it affected India, it affected thinking, and in the entire Eurasian landmass was affected. The axial age was built on the fact that event had happened, eventology had started. And after that, the Indians and the Chinese too started dealing with, could we possibly include the event in the idea of the process, or do it any other way? And the problem is that if you start doing process without the event, after the event of the arrival of the event itself, you arrive in nothing but blatant paganism, which you cannot do if you're going to create a civilization built on permanent settlement. You end up with constant warfare and lynch mobs constantly, like paganism, uncontrolled paganism. The alternative is, of course, then to go with the event without the process, which I would say the Christianity and Islam try to do. And the problem, if you take the event out of the process, you arrive with such a strict hierarchy of linear time, the circular time disappears from worldview entirely. And I think the problem is that we have to realize that we both have to see the world from a circular perspective and from a linear perspective at the same time. I think when we have talked about, Thomas, when we have talked about that we must do Tantra and go Tantra in Western culture, the next thing we do, otherwise we're lost. I think what that actually means is that we have to be able to think the linear and the circular at the same time. We have to be able to think both process and event. And that means we have to think both process / oscillation. And we also have to be able to think event as in negation. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, this sounds more like philosophical anthropology a la Girard than hardcore metaphysics a la Whitehead. So we kind of, I mean, there's already a clear distinction. Cadell.
I'm just trying to imagine you trying to avoid bowling balls down the alley there, and you're just sliding all over the floor right now. Are you okay?
Oh, you know, you get used to
it. So I agree with. So I really like everything that Bard said as a start, but I would also like to say that. In relation to what Thomas said, I think primarily in this conversation, at least for my interest, we're mostly doing more on the side of a philosophical anthropology in the binary you're setting up. Like if the binary is between a philosophical anthropology more on the side of Girard versus a hardcore quantum mechanics, general relativity on the side of Whitehead. I think we should focus more on the philosophical anthropology. And if, our work in metaphysics towards the philosophical anthropology side leads to some insight on the other side of things, then that would be interesting. But I don't think that that will be necessarily the case in this conversation. And I just want to say that as it relates to my intellectual background, my intellectual background has always been motivated by something like a philosophical anthropology. I started in anthropology. That was my first interest. And my knowledge never really, or at least my own aim was never really to leave the way knowledge related to the human world. So at least in this conversation, I would like to keep it, that way. I would like to keep it closer to us as humans, as a starting point. And in that sense, I think Bard's starting point with process and event, where you have this circular repetition of the same as the basis of, like, if we think about, we all have this idea of hunter-gatherers, and we all have this idea of sedentary culture. We have this break between a hunter-gatherer sort of human life and a sedentary human civilization life. You can think about this as the difference between sort of not the way humans experienced life as hunter-gatherers would be as this circular repetition is the same. And the way humans experience life in civilization is where there's this event which you can think of as the future is going to be slightly different than the present. Mm-hmm. And now I think that in where we are in 2020, 2021, we're seeing the gap between generations becoming so large that it's revealing, I think, an underlying negativity. I don't know how to say this other than that in the nomadological worldview, in the hunter-gatherer worldview, there's almost no difference. The way I think is easiest to conceptualize it is there's almost no difference between what I'm going to do when I grow up and what my father is doing now. What I'm doing when I grow up, if I'm in the hunter-gatherer world, what I'm doing when I grow up is like, I look at my father and I see I can model him because he's doing what I'm going to be doing. In the sedentary culture, there's more of a gap between what my father's doing and what I'm going to be doing. It's not a huge gap. If we're farmers, it's going to be, probably a lot of the same. If we're in major cities, it might be a bigger gap. And I think now we're in a situation where the gap is so large that I can't look at my father and say anything about what my life's going to be like. Mm-hmm. So this is all breaking down.
So there's this acceleration, right? And of time, in a sense, that we're talking about here. Well, I want to bring it back to process and event and from the religious perspective, because one of the things you say is die better, die again, which sounds like reincarnation to me in some ways, because if you die again, then you've already been born, and you're dying, you're being born. And so this is nomadology. And in the East, this is a universal, view that there's karma and there's reincarnation, and you die over and over again. And that's the eternal, the eternal return and all that. So that's universal in the East. And people think that way in terms of multi-lifetime. They call it a multi-lifetime view. There's not just one lifetime, there's a multi-lifetime view, which you might not agree with, but it's kind of pragmatic because it helps you think that you're not just, you don't just start from a tabula rasa state, here I am, and then I die. So there's that view. That's what you're calling process. And then in the Christian world, there's just this, we're waiting for Christ to be, come back again. And we're waiting for this major event, and time just speeds up until the second coming or whatever. And I think that's how I'm seeing those two views. And I'm also seeing that they're falling into each other, that the West is coming East and the East is coming West, and it's becoming one totality of a world.
Well, there's also a third option there. That is that death is absolute. You die when you die. What you just mentioned is the process without the event, which is the reincarnation. Mm-hmm. And what you then mentioned is the event without the process, which is eternal life. I think reincarnation, eternal life are bullshit, both of them, But because
Yeah,
we find
I
it so
don't-
we
that's
find
it.
it wait, we find it so hard to accept death. And especially in mainstream culture, we still today find it so incredibly hard to accept death. And maybe it was only small priestly castes sometimes that could accept death as an absolute, and the rest of humanity just can't. And if they can't, they can't. And I think this is the difference between Sutra and Tantra. The Sutra acknowledges that, oh, there's reincarnation or there's the eternal life. Okay? And the Tantra acknowledges that, no, death is death. Life,
Well, it's-
life's
it's
I've
all-
never heard of that in
way
tantric
around.
knowledge, but you know, in any tantric school I've ever heard of, I've never heard of that. So that to me is just total materialism.
No,
I mean-
no. That's Persian and Jewish Tantra. Okay, it's not Indian or Tibetan Tantra, maybe, but it's Persian and Jewish Tantra, definitely. The Tantric is that what other people cannot know or cannot know yet, and therefore they cannot handle it, but you can handle it because you're now grown up. You're grown up enough, you're mature enough to actually be able to handle that knowledge.
There's
And I
also
think-
the point that reincarnation is a terrible thing. You know, it's an absolute terrible thing.
Yeah, but
to be
wait,
reincarnated
Andrew,
as
can I
well.
just-
So it's
yeah,
not
yeah.
it's not an escape if
Yeah.
you're reborn as a a pig.
Yeah, I know. That is the Buddhist position, that you try to get out of the reincarnation. That's an acceptable position. I think exactly when you try to get out of the reincarnation, or when you realize eternity is not going to happen, that's when you become mature. And yes, it's within Buddhism and Zoroastrianism and Judaism you find those traits. That's why I'm a big fan of those three religions, because I think the other ones are cheap shots.
But I don't know any version of reincarnation which says that it just gets better each time you're, you know.
No,
I've
it gets
never
the
heard of that.
same. It gets the same. It's the same all over and over again. That's what reincarnation is.
No, because there's karma, and if you do bad things in your life, you get born in hell. And if and if you do virtuous things in your life, then you get born in a better state.
That's when reincarnation is thrown into permanent settlements, and you create a class society where you have people that are superior and inferior to each other. That's when you get then. So that's when you get these explanations, but it's still reincarnation. It's still evens out. It's a zero-sum game over time. That's the point with reincarnation, because it is fostered on a society with the eternal return of the same is the only idea. That's the point. And I think it's a lie. But I think it's a lie we human beings need to tell each other, because life becomes so unbearable to the vast majority of us if you don't accept absolute death. I don't think the vast majority of people can accept absolute death, just like they cannot accept absolute chaos. But death and chaos is what we're surrounded with constantly. That's the truth.
I want to hear Thomas speak about reincarnation. What you think of reincarnation, Thomas?
Well, okay, good. We bring up Whitehead, right? So Whitehead is a process philosopher, and so I thought it was an enormous experience to read Whitehead's philosophy, because Whitehead is a mathematician and also a physicist, and he wrote this mind-boggling. He wrote I think he wrote Process and Reality in 1925, and this is basically a very elaborate metaphysics that is a process metaphysics, so a process philosophy, which doesn't deal with objects. It's not a world of atoms and objects, but it's a world of process. And when you have really thought about this, now I'm not saying that this is in some sense true or false, but it's a completely different way of thinking about reality. And then talking about things like death, when I hear Alexander talk about death, then I hear a materialist talking, who is extremely certain that he understands death and there are no questions there. Now, after reading Whitehead, and also after reading one of his predecessors, Gustav Wegener, William James, so the whole question of death becomes quite complicated when you are living in a world that is based on process and not on objects. Then there's suddenly like an enormous amount of questions, and this is a very big topic in the field of process philosophy. So just by just stating like, oh, death is the end and this and that, you haven't explained anything. You haven't even started an interesting conversation.
Yeah, let's hear from Cadell a bit. How are you reacting to all this, Cadell? I think you. Sorry, everybody. We're using a new kind of Zoom here, and we're not used to it yet, so apologies for that.
All right,
Just
so
keep yourself unmuted, Thomas, if you can.
the way I would try to engage with this is, the reality has always been that the deepest so my view is, the reality has always been that the deepest transformations come with confronting death. So it's not a view that you just die. When you die, you die. Like my granddad always said, when you're dead, you're dead. It's not that view so much. It's that in confronting death while you're alive, you have the opportunity for the deepest form of transformation. And in relationship to process and event, and then the third category potentially being negativity, in the process view, you obfuscate this reality of death by identifying with a generational identity. So the son identifies with the father. I'm going to be like my father when I grow up. I'm going to be like my mother when I grow up. And it's just going to be the same over and over, repeating over and over again. In civilization, you have still this identification between generations. I am identifying with my father, or I'm identifying with an older male figure, or I'm trying to become some different male figure that is some sort of model in the Girardian sense, some model that I'm basing my desire for, some object of desire that I'm trying to attain. What I'm saying is that the third idea of, and basically saying that the third idea is becoming necessary because the gap between generations is becoming so wide that you lose all reference point. It makes no sense anymore to say, I'm going to look at my father and I'm going to be like him when I grow up. All of those reference points are getting destroyed. The generations are becoming wider and wider apart. That what is being revealed here, and this is a revelation in the sense of like a truth being revealed, a deep truth being revealed, is like in the sense of like the ancient notion of an apocalypse, like where the apocalypse is like a truth being revealed, is that the deepest mode of transformation has never been modeling yourself based on someone else, but confronting death itself. And that's the meaning of die again, die better. The meaning of die again, die better is not some reincarnation notion. It's basically like an undead subjectivity, here's the thing. It's almost like trying to create the feeling you have when you're playing video games. When you're playing video games, like if I'm playing Super Mario as a kid, I feel safe when I die because I have many lives. So I can go on an adventure. I can take incredible risk. I can go up against incredible enemies because I know if I die, I'm just going to be reborn at the same place again. So the idea of die again, die better is almost taking this notion and not, taking risks where you're certainly going to die, but to take risks. And you take risks by confronting basically your own metaphorical death. That's the idea.
I like that actually as a version of reincarnation. Mario Brothers, that's a pretty good one. But I think Mario Brothers sort of, that describes life, reality, because you just keep doing things and then dying and then being reborn again. Like you go through stages of life. You keep trying to do it and you keep going around and then you have to try a new game. And each time you play the game, you're a little bit more skilled.
Well, I get interested in the catalyst ideas was I developed the idea of eventology together with Jan Söderqvist as what happened in Persia 3,700 years ago was the first eventology, Zoroastrianism. And the West came out of it. And then, of course, we have the vulgar versions, which is event without process. We also have those people who try to attempt to create a worldview that both has event and process, that's both linear and circular when it comes to time at the same time. Some things are repeated constantly, and some things are new and fresh. And I think today, the age we live in right now, we live in an age of sort of hysterical, vulgar eventology. The idea, for example, that we are progressive politically, that we're changing for the better, that we're getting rid of a certain patriarchy that was evil. All these fancy stories we've been told these days are just bullshit all the way through, because we are biologically almost the same. What's timeless with us human beings is that every generation is born almost the same. If anything, our brains have shrunk over the last 5,000 years. We're getting more stupid because we're becoming more dependent on technology that surrounds us than actually we can trust our own minds any longer. And we're also becoming more dependent on, the accumulation of processing information. through technology than we are on our own minds. So we're getting more stupid, if anything. We're not getting smarter in ourselves, but we can afford maybe to call ourselves timeless in the sense that the biological programming of human beings actually is almost identical from one generation to the next. It's only the environment around us, it's the technological environment around us that is changing so rapidly. And therefore, it's actually us that are the process. And this is why Hegel first and then later Whitehead are so important. They bring back process into Western philosophy. And they have to do so because it's lacking. It's been eventology for the last 200 years, following Christianity and following Descartes. Kant's been eventological. And we're now going into modernity and also postmodernity that also gets stuck with eventology and vulgar eventology, like there's progressive politics and there's time for improvement. And of course, woke culture today portrays itself as being progressive, although it's incredibly reactive and reactionary, right? So we know that what we're being told is no longer true. And then, of course, we have to go to spirituality, hopefully even religion, and we have to go to metaphysics to redefine ourselves and find some grounding. And the word for that grounding is paradigmatics. Paradigmatics is that what is timeless, you must recognize as timeless. That is the processual aspect of what it means to be human. But what is time-specific, what has become an event, for example, the arrival of the internet 30 years ago, what does that mean to us, and how does that affect us, and how does that change us and our society, is of course the event. And that is properly integrating process and event in your worldview. The word for that is paradigmatics, the values we should have in the times we live. What is time specific and what is timeless about the times we live in. And to make that distinction first before we do anything is absolutely important. And there it turns out, for example, that the gender wars that we currently live with is completely derailed. Men and women are actually very different from one another. And we're being told that we should be the same, while at the same time it's dead important to have equal numbers of us both in a room. You know, these messages we're being told now are so distorted and almost apocalyptic that we need to watch out.
Yeah. Well, what I want to get from you guys, you know, you have this idea of absolute negativity, which you can definitely find in Buddhism and Christianity. What's the novel thing here? What are you so excited about it in terms of this idea? Because I'm trying to get that.
The word that Cadell introduces, negatology. He played around with our word eventology. Mm-hmm. And basically argued that there must be a negation before an event can happen. So the event is first an anti-event that then becomes an event. And the name of the anti-event is death. Something has to die for something new to be born.
To be reborn. Sorry.
No, reborn. No, stop that.
We're not going into reincarnation.
For something entirely new to be born. Mm-hmm. If there is novelty in history, if something occurs in history, like the internet, for example, that never existed before, could not even have been imagined.
Okay.
Then that changes history in a radical new way. And that's where the event comes in. That was easy to spot the event. But what's really, really interesting, actually to spot that something else has to die. So for example, today when the internet explodes, all the old institutions, all the old paradigm are dying, screaming. Politics is dying. Academia is dying. Mass media is dying. Advertising is dying. Old industry is dying. And they're all screaming at the top of their lungs, trying to save themselves. And they're all being filled by mediocre administrators and bureaucrats, which is exactly what's going to happen when it's apocalyptic, right? So they cause enormous damage by not dying. They should just die. And if they die, they would leave space for new institutions fitting the new paradigm to then form. That's
so exactly. Is it something like the art of dying? Was that something like
that's how we get bloody revolutions, because the old institutions don't die when they should, and they survive as zombie institutions. That's what happened with feudalism in Europe and after the French Revolution, and we're stuck with the same thing all over again.
I think to connect what Bard's saying to potentially something that might be interesting for Thomas is this concept of the art of dying, because it's really the situation in what Bard's describing with the old paradigms, and I can just directly relate this to my experience, is that it's almost like the older generation is clinging on to some eternal image and trying to reify their existence as something that's going to exist forever, instead of confronting the reality of death and fundamental transformation and something new really emerging. And I think that this brings me anyway to the dialectics of the self, where ultimately, if you're really exploring yourself, I do think you have to confront death while you're alive and learn how to die wisely, so that you embed yourself in something larger than yourself. And the reason why that might connect to something Thomas is interested in is because I think it involves an individual's relationship to violence. So when you have this idea that you're unconsciously, that you're eternal and you're going to exist forever. Like I just had a conversation with someone in my apartment building in the kitchen. I was telling her about the book I'm writing with Bard, and she said, "Oh, I think I walk around like I'm going to live forever." You know, just spontaneously, unconsciously, people walk around as if they're going to live forever, but they're not. So that's what I'm saying, bringing this into consciousness. And I said that the people who do this walk around unconscious as if they're going to live forever. I think they exhibit a form of violence in their speech, in their power, in their actions in society that's trying to preserve themselves forever. Whereas I think turning violence in on oneself, not to actually commit suicide, but to learn how to die gracefully and wisely, which is a very difficult question. I can't answer that question in myself, not yet, is what saves you from doing this, and which can potentially revive paradigms, to build a new paradigm. And another connection that might be interesting for Thomas, I think, is that it could be that the symbol of Jesus is a symbol that points in this direction somehow. You know, that where the violence of the mob is something that's inverted in the symbol of Jesus. I don't know if I'm understanding that correctly, how Thomas will understand it, but that's how I'm trying to think it, is that this violence is somehow becomes inverted.
Sounds perfectly correct to me. Thomas, what do you think?
Well, there's an enormous amount of ideas. I think we're definitely more in the realm of anthropology than in the realm of metaphysics, as far as I can see. Okay, so the theme of death seems to be very central here. What was it again, Cadel? Die again, die better, right?
Yeah, well, that's anyway. It's a slogan I got from Alenka Zupancic through Samuel Beckett, who basically said that the "Die Again, Die Better" slogan is an interesting model to think death drive.
Death drive. Okay, interesting. Yeah. So this is something that this is something very central to Tantra with the six. There's the six realms of Tantra. So there's this let's say this crude interpretation of reincarnation, where you die and then you come back as a pig or as a rooster or as a snake or something like that. But then there is also the other interpretation where you constantly find yourself in one of the six realms, and they're basically these very basic ways of being, right? The God realm, that's when you're sitting on the beach and everything is great and you don't have a care in the world, like that woman that you talked to, right? That woman who said, "Oh, I'm gonna live forever," or I walk around like I'll live forever.
Yes, that's the key.
That would be the God realm.
That's the God realm.
The God realm of the Buddhists, right? And then the let's say the person who has a startup and who is working really hard to make millions of dollars and who's focusing on everything on that, that's the jealous God realm, right? So you're very close to the realm of perfection, but you have to do a lot of work to get there. And then you have the other realms. You have the hell realm, you have the hungry ghost realm, you have the human realm. And the problem is that you cannot stay in these realms. So you cannot stay in the God realm. So many people, they have this, they meditate and they have a great experience, or they drop some acid and they feel that they're one with the world. And then they feel they're in the God realm, right? But what they don't realize is none of these realms stay around. They all disappear. You constantly die in one realm and then you appear in the next one. So one day you're in the God realm, maybe you're in the God realm for 6 months, but one day you're going to wake up in the hell realm, right? So you die again. And you're right, you know, Tantra is about dying better. It's about dealing with all of these realms and dealing with them in a better way, because every realm has its own benefits. You know, the hell realm of anger and heartbreak and misery, that teaches you empathy. And the God realm, that gives you opportunities to help others. So you learn how to make the best of the realm that is thrown at you, and you also accept that you will constantly, those realms will end, and you will have to go through this state where one realm stops and the other realm isn't there yet, and you're nowhere, but still you're somewhere. And this is what the Buddhists call the bardo experience. Again, that can be interpreted in a very literal way. The bardo is the moment when it's the moment between, it's the time span between dying and reincarnation. But it could also be these moments where you're so angry that suddenly you're not angry anymore. But where are you then? Where are you? And these are very interesting states of mind to recognize.
Yeah, I would kind of add to that a little bit, because I've studied these realms a lot, and you know, in each of these realms there's a Buddha, right? You know, a kind of an ideal, you know, which represents an energetic. So there's the you, who's the fucked up guy in the hell realm who's full of aggression, or you know, there's the jealous entrepreneur guy, or there's the, you know, the guy in the God realm, and when he falls down into the hell realm, it's really bad because he's spent eons in the God realm. And but in each of these realms, there's actually a transformative aspect. So it's not, so the interesting thing about it is there's not really a duality. Like, you don't really get rid of these characteristics. You transform them into power, you know. So aggression is very necessary. That's the hell realm, and you know, all of these realms are a necessary, essential part of reality, in, you know, of the real world in the moment. So yeah, it isn't an afterlife kind of mentality at all. It's really it's really your phenomenological experience.
I'd say this is where Buddhism and Judaism do a much better job than my favorite, Zoroastrianism and Christianity, because in Zoroastrianism you have the asatas and you have saints in Christianity. So you have certain people who assumably lived certain concentrated lives, and they were the different realms in that sense. You identify with them. But then you get stuck in just one of them. The beauty of the Buddhist idea is that you walk through these different realms. So you have to go from one to the next, which is much more what life is like.
Yeah, but usually you have you're dominant in one of them. Like, you have one Buddha that you're dominant in, even though you experience them all.
Yeah, but we could call that the archetypes, and we have certain personality traits that we're more or less of. But I think Buddhism and Judaism also does this much better, because by not having the sainthoods all over the place, but rather teach people the different realms here, and you could be in all of them, and you have to walk into them, you have to know about them, and even if you're not in one of them, maybe your best friend or your mother is. You know, it's I think it's better. I think it's wisdom. I think it's brilliant.
Well, there's a dark aspect to humanity that's acknowledged there as well, because, you know, saints are always so pure and perfect, whereas many of the Buddhist saints were like serial killers first, like, you know, what's his name, Milarepa. First, he was a serial killer and a black magician before he, you know, became a yogic ascetic and ate nothing but pine needles and learned how to fly. And, you know, all these stories, the stories are not about perfect. I mean, not all the Christian saints are either.
No, but the asatas can be both. Where do you think you got the word deva or demon from?
Yeah.
It's from Zoroastrianism. So
there's less idealization of the human personality, I think.
But the problem is that this mice into mimetics, which Thomas often talks about. He says that by having role models or lesser gods there, you identify with them, which is very pagan. So that's Zoroastrianism inherited that from Hinduism, shared that you have the asatas in Zoroastrianism are obviously the lesser gods in Hinduism. And Judaism did not do that, and Buddhism did neither, because they taught directly to people how their lives would be. So it's not about, that's the guy, you're like him, now you mimic him. But rather it's more like, there are these different realms, and there are different people maybe who lived in them, but you have to be able to go through all of them, actually, if you're a complete human.
Yeah, I love where this conversation's going. I see. Yeah, so many ideas are overlapping for me. I mean, the first one is actually something that Sweeny just said, which is first starting with the darker aspect of humanity. That if you want to really understand the highest states, you have to first really confront the darkest states. I always give the example because I sort of studied it myself as some sort of dark perversion. Was the let's say the phenomenology of Ted Bundy. It's like, what's going on there? You know, like what's going on when Ted Bundy's doing those types of things? Like, what's that inner motivation? Like like, not just using him as like the only example, but like, what is that? You know, that deep, dark killing drive. And the weird thing with Ted Bundy and why it's so interesting is because killing, fucking, and eating all sort of collapse in on themselves in a weird little ritual, which he had to keep doing. And it was so intrinsic. I don't know if you guys know the story of Ted Bundy, but like, it's an incredibly interesting story. But the point is that there's something sacred about whatever that experience was he was having. And I think unless you understand that dimension of yourself, then the image you have of perfect being is just a stupid illusion. You know, like you're not really connected to the thing. And of course, like I'm not justifying anything that, you know, serial killers do or something like that, but more just saying, you know, basically echoing what Sweeny was saying, that saints were connected to something very dark first, and they had to go through.
Well, there's one guy, Do Kenze, he had 1,000 consorts, and one of them was his sister. You know, this is a 19th century Tibet.
And that's incest.
That's incest, yes.
But so that's again
so
connected.
He wasn't so politically correct. He used to run around with a shotgun, and he'd go into monasteries and he'd take a shit in the monastery, and then he'd leave, and then he'd shoot, you know, and he'd go around shooting like, you know, animals and people and scaring the shit out of everybody. And he's a Buddhist, a revered Buddhist. You know, there's millions of stories about him from Eastern Tibet, which is like the cowboy area of Tibet, right? Where all the wild, you know, anti-establishment, anti-Dalai Lama people are. Anyway. But yes, you know, I absolutely agree. I think that's why I was attracted to Tantra and why I couldn't stand all that singing in church, you know.
And then the next point of connection is maybe both between what you said, Sweeny, and what Thomas said about the Bardo experience. It was a really clear explanation of the Bardo experience where I think Thomas said it's like this time span between dying and reincarnation. Is that correct, Thomas? Was that the definition?
Everything intensifies in the Bardo state.
Yes.
Everything becomes incredibly intense in the Bardo state, in the transformational state. And we're kind of living in a Bardo state right now. I mean,
but what I'm trying to
because
do is
we are going between paradigms, right?
Yes, but what I'm trying to do is to try to get it out of the mythological dimension of it, which obfuscates your own experience of it in the present moment. You know, your actual dying and dying again better. It like working with yourself while you're here now, as opposed to mythologizing it as, oh, when I'll die, I'll be reincarnated as a different form. Like, that's ridiculous to me.
I don't think you're working with yourself mythologizing. Now. I think it's like, I like to include it. I don't like to reject it. I like to include it in the whole mythopoetic experience of religion.
I agree with Cadell and Bart there that this idea that when you die, you go somewhere and things will be solved. That can be that can be very delusional. So I can understand why Alexander is worried about this, or why he would want to emphasize. You know, there is something very, very serious about death that you will have to relate.
Well, it's the first thing you learn in Buddhist practice is there's no self, there's no ego, and there's impermanence. It's like the first thing you learn is to meditate about death. That's like that's like number one. Like they have really like graphic descriptions of how the fluids come from your body. You know, you can read it in 19th century text with the most graphic descriptions of death and hell and all of that. It's like, it's not Peter Pan land. It's definitely not Harry Potter land, as you know, Bard often says. But I think the mythology is deep as well.
I think what I want to say is we need to get in Lacanian terms, from a Lacanian perspective, we need to get the terminology right as it relates to the imaginary dimension and the real dimension. And I think a lot is at stake here, and I think that at least from, why sometimes, maybe, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Sweeny, but maybe well, I can speak, for example, one of my co-authors on sex masculinity, Daniel Dick, would be more in this mythological category, where what I see, the way I see someone like him relating to the Bardo experience is in this projection in a chain of other lives, where the image of me being reincarnated in other forms at other places in time is kind of getting in the way of him confronting some deep, dark violence in himself. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize. I'm trying to emphasize getting in touch with a deep, dark violence in yourself now and not covering it up with an image of some other life. And I'm not saying that there aren't important, interesting, images that are appearing here. On the contrary, there are very dark, deep, interesting images that are appearing here, and they can also be very beautiful. But understanding the dynamics.
Do you know what the protectors look like? They wear human skulls and they're standing on corpses, and they have weapons and teeth, and their eyes are bloodshot, and they're not Disney Bambi characters. I mean, and they are there to wake you up to existential. They're there to take you through the Bardo.
But the question is this relevant for us today, though? I mean, the myths are only valuable to us, or else they're just history. I'd like to emphasize here the Persian take is that there is no word for life itself, because the two different lives they're talking about. So the way they get out of the reincarnation loop, and therefore they do not build pyramids, which is what you do if you celebrate eternal life. Eventually, the most powerful people build bigger and bigger pyramids, and the entire economy, like in Egypt during the Bronze Age, goes into building pyramids until it collapses and never rises again, right? Or reincarnation is the obsession, and then you just kill and you mercilessly kill constantly because everybody's reincarnated. Life has no meaning because you reincarnate all the time. Those are the vulgar versions of it. That's true. But the way the Persians did it was that they had two words for it. One is Ameretat, the other was Hauruvatat. Muslims tried to buy this into it, but had two angels called Hurat and Murat, whatever, but that's not the same thing. Hauruvatat is to be lucky enough to live a complete life. If you're lucky enough to live a full life, and you're tired of living, you're ready to die, you really want to die. It's just like, oh, I've done it all, seen it all. Why don't I just die and disappear, and some other life can take the place of me, which is exactly negatology going into eventology, right? And the other one is Ameretat. Ameretat means transcendence. It's wrongly translated off as immortality, because it isn't. Ameretat is that which transcends you. So that's the life of the community. And of course, the life of the community is primary. Your own life is secondary. Your own subjectivity is secondary to the intersubjectivity of the community, and any decent tribal community, because it's tribal poetical, it's not autopoetical. So the pointer is that Ameretat is the most important. It's the life of the community that existed before you were born, and it's the life of the community that exists after you're dead. And in between that, there's only your own life, which is the Hauruvatat. If you're lucky enough to live a good life, you could die when you're 13 and live a full life. You can die when you're 95, doesn't matter. But if you were lucky enough to live a full life, and then if you were lucky enough to live a full life, the community may decide you were important to them. The community may decide you're a role model for the rest of the community. And in the case that happens, they will then celebrate the day of your death for the next 70 years. They will not build a pyramid. They will throw your corpse to the vultures or the coyotes in North America, as they do now, or dogs or whatever, so they can eat it, because that's just corpse. That's nothing. You're dead. But your memory is what's important to the community. So you survive in the community as the Ameretat. And the Ameretat is celebrated through the Polgazar, which is the day of your death for the next 70 years. After that, you should not be important to the community any longer, because after 70 years after you're dead, other people should be more important to the community than you ever were, right? Otherwise, the community is completely failed. So the next 70 years, the day of your death is celebrated. That's the Polgazar, which I think is a beautiful tradition, because it prevents a society from just killing people mercilessly, saying they all be reincarnated like you do in India. But it also prevents you from investing the entire economy into building a pyramid for the biggest guy who just died.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is civilized.
Well, in Tibet, you know, what you do is you cut up the body. You know, what you do is first you spend many days around the body chanting and singing and like for hours and hours on end. You don't just throw the body in a.
No, it's the same in
This is very intelligent.
Yeah,
and then the next thing you do is
it is the same tradition.
You cut it up. You cut up the pieces and you put them to the vultures, and the vultures, you know, consume all the flesh off the bones, and then you grind the bones into a small powder and you color it, and then you throw it in the river. And that's such a more intelligent way of dealing with death than our culture even, you know, conceives of, you know. So this kind of brutal realism, you know, I think we need the ceremony and the mythopoetics surrounding death. That's what I'm sort of.
But it's the same thing in Persia. You do certain things the second, third, fourth day, and up to the seventh day, etc. You do that as well with the course before you throw it away. But there are also different traditions here. What is so interesting here, what we tie in what you and I and Thomas have talked about before, Andrew, is that it's Vajrayana Buddhism and Zen Buddhism who teaches you that there is no ego there. There's nothing there. And that's the same thing the Zoroastrians teach you. Or rather teach you your subjectivity is a byproduct of your tribal membership. It's a byproduct of your social relations. You do not exist without the tribe at all. And that's exactly what Zoroastrians are skeptical of people who live outside the community and don't want to take part in it. Unless you're part of the community and contribute to the community, you're an absolute nobody.
Mm-hmm.
You're dangerous. That's the point. Subjectivity is a byproduct of the tribal singularity. That's the way you would phrase it in both Persia and Tibet.
That's the Girardian idea of maybe more Ugurlian, you know, the self of desire, right? So what is the self? Well, from that point of view, it's a collection of desires that you've picked up from others around you.
Oh yeah, the self is a collection of desires, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the self is not in. So nothing reincarnates like as a self.
Well,
definitely.
That's the thing with process philosophy, right? I mean, in the Whitehead, okay, now we're jumping around a lot, but for Whitehead, so you have the world consists of actual occasions, and so they go into this process of concrescence, and they have a satisfaction, and that's the end of it. So we are constantly everything is basically constantly blossoming and dying. So it's kind of like a droplets of subjectivity that constantly arise and then go through a process and then end. So in that sense, so if you start thinking of the whole, let's say the whole world like that, then the concept of death becomes very interesting, because in some sense this death in a very fundamental way is constantly ongoing in Whitehead's metaphysics. So we are basically made up of actual occasions, which are like tiny processes who constantly start, go through a process of concrescence, and then end.
That's exactly
why
Whitehead
we're
is,
back at fundamental.
Yeah, but that's why Whitehead is so useful. Whitehead doesn't really do a complete metaphysics. He doesn't claim to have one. Maybe he would have if he lived longer or whatever. But he's brilliant to work from. The reason why I worked with Alexander Vrede Elung on the transcendental emergentism is that we started from Whitehead because we were a reaction against Zizek. We were a reaction against dialectical materialism. And then after Zizek, there's Adrian Johnston, who then constructed a transcendental materialism. And what Alexander Vrede Elung and I wanted to do was to get rid of materialism altogether. It's just like, okay, by neutralizing neutral monism, very, very widely, by neutralizing anything that occurs whenever it occurs in the universe, by just neutralizing it, saying that it doesn't have any picking order, it doesn't have any status, because something happens before something else doesn't make it higher or lower. By just flattening out everything that happens, you can then start looking at the entire history of the universe and potentially the future of the universe and see that emergences are the things that we actually orientate ourselves afterwards, because we choose to do so, because we're human. And those emergences, for example, the birth of physics, the birth of chemistry, the birth of biology, the birth of mind, the birth of culture, all those things that have happened that are the most important events that happen can then be studied. And then we must apply Hegel to Whitehead, simply by saying that they can only be studied if we allow ourselves to constantly change the entire history of the universe, because if something new happens, it forces us to rethink the entire history of the universe up until now, because necessity can only be in the past, whereas the future is always contingent. And that's where Hegel and Whitehead are tied together, according to me. Whitehead gave us a perfect platform to work from by establishing a transcendental emergentism. That's our metaphysics.
And I just want to say when Hamelryck says we're constantly jumping around, to remind him that he's the cat in the bowling alley here. He's the one jumping around everywhere. Bart and I are just still and calm. He's just, oh my God, another
He's
ball
wild,
coming
yeah.
at me, and what do I
just-
do here? I'm jumping from Whitehead to Girard, and where am I?
And I propose something here, though, coming out of this discussion, and it's very Girardian, I would say there are no new religions per se. Actually, I would even say the religion hasn't happened. I think we've got lots of spiritualities and claims to spirituality everywhere. But if you really try to grasp death and try to grasp contingency and start to live with them properly, maybe we could one day have religion. But if we do have religion, it can only be reformed. It can never be new. There cannot be any new religion except a reformed paganism. The idea of process and event, and especially we tie negation to the event. So the event is impossible without negation first. But if negation must happen before, it's like process is before event historically, but in metaphysics, you turn it around and say, okay, what if event happens before process? And that's negation prior to oscillation, which is perfectly feasible. But if you try to play with these things dialectically back and forth, like if you do that, you could only ever aim for a religion that would be a reformed paganism. That would have to be its proper name historically. It couldn't be anything else.
Reformed paganism.
Yeah, because it can only be the religion of the tribe.
But,
And the religion of the tribe is either process, pure process, or it's process and event.
But
If it tries to
paganism,
be,
so for me, paganism is a society, like the Roman Empire was a pagan empire. Ancient Greece was pagan. Paganism means that you found your society upon the lie that there is one person who's absolutely guilty of everything, and you regularly kill that person. That's paganism.
no, that's not. That's
that is
paganism.
for me kind of something that we should at all price avoid to go back.
Paganism is more than that, but it's an aspect of paganism. Yes, that's why I said reformed paganism. Okay, so the question is, how do you avoid that if you want to avoid it?
So what's a reformed paganism then? In what sense
Because
is it still paganism?
Because the eternal return of the same is also reality. And my point is that if you try to skip the process and go only for event, which is my problem with Christianity and Islam constantly, is that you get a vulgar religion that is no longer feasible, has no credibility left. You build pyramids at the end of the day. That's all you do if you do event without the process. And reality is that process is there. That's a timeless aspect of being human. An event is there. It's a time-specific aspect of being human. And paradigmatics, the values that we nurture in a society have to be both. That means the event allows for the reformation of paganism, but it's a reformed paganism. There's nothing, anything else. There's never anything else.
It seems to me that the event is kind of this is about this death, because there's a linear process from here to death. Like that is the event that you guys are, that's what you're promoting here. Whereas the process, right, is this kind of eternal world of returning festivals. And, you know, in an example from the tradition I practice in, it would be that in October, you would worship the protector who destroys everything. So you worship death, like you worship death because death, something needs to die, as Cadell says, to be reborn. And you would do that in October. And then in the springtime, you would worship life because so you would worship life as this goddess who was resplendent and nude and covered in jewels. It was the most gorgeous thing you could imagine. And so you worship both. I mean, I don't know.
I think the difference is that once we settle permanently and we start burying people, death becomes much more of an absolute. So I would say that absolute death, I wouldn't expect to find in a nomadic society, and it's certainly not part of any nomadological religion. It's just reincarnation. It's like, oh, your uncle died last week. We cremated him. Oh, you had a cousin born yesterday. We give him the same name. Pretend it's the same guy, right? The soul is just transferred from one body to the next. That is pop religion, the pagan version. That's what reincarnation, people believe in reincarnation in societies that thrive on reincarnation. They really do. They believe souls are reincarnated. They believe the soul leaves the body and the soul moves into a new body and it's reincarnated. And if you've done bad, you move into a fly. And if you don't good, you move
that's
into
kind of literal
else.
Because that's kind of a literalist version of reincarnation.
Okay. I've traveled around the Indian countryside for many years, Andrew. That's what the vast majority of Indians believe.
Sure, because peasants always believe that the most, but there's also a reason for that. And the reason for that is it's intelligent to have a multi-lifetime view because that's an intelligent way to think.
Yeah, but I don't listen.
Life
I don't
and then
want,
death,
yeah,
and then
Andrew,
tabula rasa.
Andrew, I can defend the caste system being incredibly efficient in running a feudal society in India. That's not the point here. The point is we're living in 2021. We are asking ourselves, what would be credible metaphysics or a credible story today, credible narrative, if you like? Well, and what would we need to do to get rid of the worst things in our society? Those are the questions we need to address here. I'm not interested in defending a society in India 600 years ago and what worked. I'm interested in looking at what are the propositions we have today and in what way are they credible? Or do we need to just throw them on the dustbin of history and say, this no longer works because the genie is out of the bottle? And absolute death is now a reality to the vast majority of people. And I don't think we're credible in denying absolute death. Absolute death is now a reality for the vast majority of people involved in this conversation right now. I just cremated a friend this morning, and he's dead. He's literally dead. He's
But who would deny that? I mean,
but let's live with that then. Let's try to live with absolute death as a reality, and then also realize that if some of us try to escape death, maybe because we love life too much, whatever excuse we have, then other people have problem just having the contingency of life, the uncontrollability of life, the chaos of life. And that's the other thing.
I get it. I mean, it makes sense. It's,
I think connecting that to what Bard's saying and what Thomas Hamelryck's saying about, in the process view, then all of a sudden death gets very interesting, is that I don't think you have real thinking unless you're thinking with death. I think it's where you get. I think it's where real thinking starts. I mean, when I've had metaphorical deaths at different stages of my life, like for example, one of the most powerful moments for me was when I was 17 and I failed high school. It was basically like a metaphorical death. It was like a huge, metaphorical wake up call, and all of a sudden I started thinking. I mean, I was jolted out of a certain reality. I was moved. It was an event. I was jolted I was disrupted out of a certain reality. There's a great scene in Fight Club that sort of echoes the same idea, where the character Tyler Durden takes a guy from a variety store, and he takes him out back with a gun to his head, and he gets him on his knees, and the guy starts crying. And he says, what did you want to be when you grew up? And he said, I wanted to be a veterinarian. And he said, why aren't you a veterinarian? He was like, oh, it's too hard. I don't want to go to school. It's too much work. He clicks back the gun and says, if you're not on your way to become a veterinarian in 2 weeks, I'm going to come back here and shoot you in the head. And then he lets him run off. The point is that being brought to this absolute negativity is a ground to actually start thinking. And the thing is that most
being alive, not thinking, but why thinking?
Thinking and
not
being
just
alive at the same time.
Fully alive. I mean, being fully alive.
Both, Sweeny. You're actually thinking and being alive, because most people are just walking around like they're not going to die and they're not really thinking.
What about the first time you have sex or something? What about the first enormous pleasurable moment? How is that different from your, like? Well, why are you focusing on death only and not?
Oh, death is much more profound than pleasure ever could be. That's why the pleasure principle is so banal in psychoanalysis. You're much more confronted with reality. I mean, hey, it's big, way deeper, bigger than just having fun or just.
No, I don't mean just having fun. I mean, profound opening. I mean,
anyway. I think sex in a way that really brings you to life is a type of metaphorical death. I think about the sexual experiences that really shook the limits of my identity. The sexual experience that really pushed my boundaries into a new type of cadet.
Sure. But I mean, in the tantric practice, what you try to do is create bliss, a lot of bliss, like an enormous amount of bliss. And this is something that it's not banal. And most people don't, the banality is just ordinary life.
But listen, that's probably, maybe that's why you reacted the way you did, Andrew, when you said living rather than thinking. I think what Cadell and I talk about the thinking process, there's nothing wrong with the living process, but I put the bliss aspect into the living, in the art of living process. There's nothing wrong with that. You know my philosophy. I very much preach the infinite now. I preach the idea of having an intensely ecstatic experience, hopefully with somebody. I usually say sex with a woman or drugs with a friend, right? But, having a really intense ecstatic experience that is so intense that the only thing you could do with it is to memorize it, right? And you learn to come down from it. And you learn the entire art of having ecstatic experiences, I think should be absolutely fundamental to religion.
Good, because I don't want to get away from this Camus existentialist, gloomy kind of like.
It's
have a coffee or
gloomy.
suicide.
I don't want to get confused with Camus. I don't want to get confused with Camus, because when Camus is thinking about death, he's thinking about it in a very gloomy way. He's basically saying like, the axiom would be something like, should I have a cup of coffee or should I shoot myself?
Yeah,
and
how can I?
I'm not saying
God or stupid stuff like that. Yeah.
No, but I think Freud hits it right when he says that what Freud is terrified of with contemporary society, and he's perfectly right, is that we drench ourselves in so much pleasure that we forget to think. And he was skeptical of what he called the oceanic feeling. And what he meant with the oceanic feeling, essentially what happens when you take morphine, for example, or heroin, it's just like you end up returning to the womb or the matrix. So you're exactly where you were the first 9 months of your existence, which was a world without problems. And you're completely one with the universe. And all this sort of new age bullshit that new age people are striving for all the time is just to be stupid inside a womb, swimming around in the womb, totally protected, loved, without thinking.
Well, agreed.
That's exactly what Freud reacts against, is that, okay, so like when people tell me that they like happiness and they want people to be happy and have a happiness index or something like that, I always tell them, not even the Bhutanese believe in that. It's a myth, right? The Bhutanese hate it because they just love television, period, right? So the happiness, if you want happiness, maximize and optimize happiness for all people, just give everybody fucking opiates until they die. Now, what would that be? It would essentially be absolute horror. Yes, because if you really want to live fully and embrace life fully and all this darkness and everything that's gutsy with it and be existentially, that says, then confronting death is where you start to think.
There's an important thing here. There's a difference between the passive experience of going in the womb, right? And then the meditative experience, which is done after years of hard, painful practice, where you're able to go into bliss and shape that. So you're like the movie director. You're not having a passive LSD thing. You're doing it. You're engaged in it. It's different. That's different because you've done the work.
That's Tantra, and we love Tantra, right?
Yes.
We're prophets of Tantra, all four of us.
Okay, go ahead, Thomas. You're rolling your eyes at me, so go ahead.
No, I'm not. I'm not rolling in my eyes at all. I'm trying to avoid the balls and the.
That's what I've said.
Meow.
Yeah, I mean, I can go off what Bard was saying about. I mean, I think what our contemporary culture is basically an opioid culture. In some, it's a society that's regulated by the pleasure principle. You have access to cheap junk food. You have access to your virtual app where like you're scrolling on an infinite number of possible sexual partners where you can have just cheap sexuality. This is just basically exploiting people's pleasure drives.
Yeah, it's food, sex, and eating. Like the recent Netflix hits were the first one was about like killing, right? And the second one was about money. And the third one was about I don't know. They were like the biggest hits of Netflix.
Yeah, because we can't escape ourselves.
It's totally passive. It's totally
totally. But that's our unconscious being represented to us.
Yeah.
That's what's really going on in our minds, and that's what we need to make active. Like to your point, Sweeny.
Yeah.
And I think it's crucial that we emphasize thinking, and thinking beyond the pleasure principle, and to realize the degree to which our thinking is conditioned by pleasure. And and I'm just saying that at least in my view, something like this mechanism, it doesn't have to be exactly this, but well, I think the principle of negation is pretty as metaphysically simple as you can get.
Mhm.
That's exactly what the state we're in. Yeah, the state we're in is called vulgar eventology.
Mhm.
So first of all, it's event without process.
Well,
It's
I
believed
agree
that there's
that
a progressive linear district. Wait, can I finish? So the vulgar eventology, that is why when you have a vulgar eventology, it's eventology without process, it's also vulgarized. It means it's nothing but kick-seeking. There's a complete kick-seeking culture. It's an incredibly addictive culture. We're moving towards society with 100% addictions. We're moving towards a society where people see kick after kick after kick. And that's all they do because they believe in the event so strongly, but in the vulgar variety of it, that seeking the next kick or higher kick is all they can do. And people do this now when they're 40, 50, 60 or so, not just when they're teenagers any longer and have a rock star model in front of them or something like that. They do their entire lives. And okay, the question is then, why do we end up there? And that is the deeper ideological question, which is that because we skipped the process, and because we skipped the process and we only went with the event went hysterical, and the event is no longer connected with the process. The only way to look at the world is to return to process and event and to proper paradigmatics. And we haven't done that yet. And we're just at the childhood stage of the internet age right now, when everything's going balloons, weird. And, we have psychotic pandemics and everything like that, simply because people don't know what they're doing. And they're doing nothing but kick-seeking.
I agree that the proper direction there is to face our own death. Like that is the proper direction to go. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, and then to have a new sutra first, because we don't have one, which is the paradigmatics. That's the sutra. And then outside of the sutra, there's also the potential to be able to handle the other powers, and that's the tantra. And for those who are capable of that and ready for it, there must be tantra. That's why the Bard Absolute has to be reinstated into our culture. I think you agreed on that in previous discussions, that without the Bard Absolute, without differentiation between Tantra Sutra, we cannot handle the current crisis at all. But that is the response to the meaning crisis. The response to the meaning crisis is that paradigms die all the time. Nietzsche didn't kill God. Nietzsche just killed one paradigm, basically Protestant Christianity that was reacting against. It was the death of a paradigm. That's the way we must read Nietzsche today. So the paradigm dies and it goes through 4 different nihilistic phases. And we then enter the naive nihilism. We're now in the cynical nihilistic phase. And we need to move into ironic nihilism to then have affirmative nihilism, which is the way out of the predicament of the paradigm shift. And the only way to do that is to have a proper sutra and a proper tantra built on the new paradigm itself. What is then first timeless? What is time specific? How do you become a winner? You want to say that in this world, in an existential sense. How do you become a winner in an attentionalist society rather than a capitalist one? That all of that has to be completed. It's a huge philosophical project, and metaphysics is core to it. Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree with this. That's and I think that brings us around back to the title of this talk, which is Metaphysical Totality, which, as I said, metaphysics is trying to think through a new form of conceptualization for being. And it's messy in the beginning, and I think our conversation was messy, but this is where it's going, is a new conceptualization. We're thinking about things like paradigmatics, tantra and sutra, process and event and negation. All of these concepts are like a conceptual foundation for a new way of thinking being right now. And it approaches totality. It gives us a narrative for this moment. It's not a perfect one. Like we've said, it's not a perfect one. No one's here trying to reify some ideology of perfection or immortality.
Well, I guess I'm worried about the danger of inflation here, because you're saying a whole new thing, but there's deep traditions that are built, thousands of years old that we're working with.
Andrew, remember what I just said? I said the timeless is the deep traditions. We call it the root of the phallus. And the time-specific part of the new paradigm is the phallus. The phallus is where we're going. That's essentially where is the promised land or the promised empire or the promised tribe or whatever it is. But where are we going? Where is that goal? Where is the direction? Where do we go next? That is what phallus and root of the phallus mean. And that's what we talk about in exodology. You leave a certain era of history to move into the next one. It's not a better one. It's just different.
Okay, so you're talking about this creative process because we're in this new time, and I can.
So the totality here is temporary. The totality is for the specific paradigm we're entering. Now, if history history would take a completely new course, if something would emerge all of a sudden that changed history forever in a whole new direction. Maybe biotechnology will do that soon. We don't know. But if that happens, then we have to again redefine the metaphysical totality of that age. That is to properly think both Hegel and Nietzsche, is to understand the totality as the totality of the specific paradigm.
Yes.
And therefore it takes a long, you need to go way, way, way into the paradigm to finally start grasping it. And then you see patterns. You see also becomes successful. Who becomes the loser in that paradigm? Why is that? Which model worked better? You need to do cultural studies. Which cultures in the world today are successful? Which cultures today fail? You need to do that without being called a racist to begin with. You need to neutrally study different cultures. That works better in the internet age than that over there. And then just teach people that, which is the sutta we need to teach people. Any woman who brings up children today wants to know, how can I make my children successful? What kind of schools do I send them to? What kind of gadgets should they have in their hands? Should I have allowed them to have Instagram when they're 11 or 15 or when they're 21? All of those questions are sutric questions that need to be addressed desperately today.
Okay. Well, we have 3 minutes left before we're gonna open it up to audience questions. And I want to prod Thomas maybe to say something, because you haven't said something in a while. Just like prod. You know, he's like a cold lizard. You have to like kick him.
One thing that I'm a bit worried about is that, well, I mean, these are all lofty ideas, and I agree with a lot of it. But the problem is that there is the intention, and then there is what drives people. And often the greatest disasters come from a group of people who think they have found a solution or a way forward. But what is really at play is this network of desire, right? We desire what other people desire. We go into competition and we start scapegoating. And I think that seems to be the basic anthropology of how humans work. It's a bit like just like Darwin figured out how evolution worked, and after that biology was never the same. It seems that Girard has kind of figured out how humans work, and we need to relate to that. And in that sense, criteria such as success and such as so basically just focusing on success and on these that can easily end up in escalation and in desire going crazy, basically. So what is actually what the core of Tantra is that you focus on you focus on something or somebody. Is it Buddha or Jesus or Zoroaster or whatever? Somebody who will not go in competition with you, but you can still use that person or that image as a model of desire, and that is the core aspect of Sutra, and that is lost in our society to a great extent. We take our neighbor or somebody on Facebook as a model. And that is the core problem of our current age. That's the meaning crisis, essentially.
So let me just respond to that quickly before you open it up, Andrew, because I mean, I agree with a lot of what Thomas is saying here. I think why I'm emphasizing the concept of negativity is because I think it's that we can use different words, but what I'm trying to point towards is basically the metaphysical dimension of how a figure like a Buddha or a Jesus comes into being, because they're not modeling them. They're not, like you said, they're not going into competition with you. In other words, they're not in this image game modeling. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And so that is in the distinction between Tantra and Sutra, because there's a very small number of people who can understand that reality. However we try to model it, whatever words we use to speak about it, it's mostly an experience that you have to confront in yourself. I mean, it's not, I mean, it's not like let me give the example of you and I. Like, the words we're saying to, like, we could get to the level, and I think the same for me and Bard, the words we're saying to each other are almost, they're like, we're not that different. You know, like the idea, like on the level of ideas, on the level of, because the underlying desire is the same. You know, and I think that in that sense, perhaps as our work develops, this is my final idea, perhaps as our work develops, we will have to get more intelligent with our Bard absolute. The distinction between inside and outside, and the boundaries of who's in and who's out, and who can handle the tantric realm and who can't. And the processes by which someone becomes tantric or someone who doesn't become tantric.
We will see. Yeah, we will see.
I would worry about trying to take that on too intentionally.
For the private and the
I would
sacred.
think that needs to be an organic process, but.
Okay, but the return of the private and the sacred is bound to happen.
Oh yeah.
Because everything in contemporary society, like the last stage of capitalism, is forcing us. It's forcing us to be profane and transparent and public about everything, and that's exactly why the return of the private and the sacred is dialectically bound to happen, and that is the opening we're looking for.
Okay, good. So we have some questions, and I think Tom is checking out the questions. Are you there, Tom?
Yes, I'm here.
Do you have a good question from somebody, and maybe that
I
person?
think Meran has asked quite a few questions there, but Meran is so all over the place in his questions that he can address me in private instead if he has many questions. Okay, I saw that Meran has posted several questions. He's overly intelligent and all that, but he throws 500 things into everything he says, right?
Okay.
So Meran is allowed to email me in private, and I can respond to him in case he doesn't get the attention he wants right now.
Okay, Tom, can you pick a salient question for us? Something that would be good.
Well, here's a question from Tony. Tony, do you want to ask the question directly, or shall I read it?
You have to unmute Tony as well,
Yeah,
because we're using bizarre Zoom software here.
Hey guys, yeah, I was really intrigued by what Cadell was talking about. And my question to Cadell is not, I mean, it's a little bit related to what I wrote. This was not really a question, but it's more like, if I got it right, if we are not confronting life while we are alive, then we are not confronting death. Like this, die and die again. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so like, let me give an example. Like I just had the conversation with a flatmate here in my apartment building. So we were talking about I was trying to explain to her like me and Bard's work, and I was basically saying like, most people walk around as if they're going to live forever, and a philosopher will actually start to think about death before they die, and from that process start to really live. So like, I think when people walk around as if they're living forever, they're not really thinking. Usually, and I guess like to connect this to Thomas's model of like a Girardian anthropology, is their thinking is modeled based on the desire of others. And they're not really thinking for themselves, but death is kind of a mechanism to shake you to the reality of yourself. This is how I'm trying to think about it.
Okay, thank you.
I could give another example if you like, Tony. Say a friend of yours dies, and there's a sense that half of you died with your friend because all the conversations, all the relations you had with that person are dead. So part of you died. At the same time, there's an obligation on you to live for both you and the friend who just died. So you're also, life is thrown back at you more intensely, like, oh God, you're tired, exhausted, a friend died, you're in grief, you're in mourning, but at the same time, you're still alive because you're still alive and your friend is dead. You are then, you then have to take on the burden of living more. So death forces us to live life much fuller. So libido comes back. You jump out from a cliff or something like that, bungee jumping, you feel more alive than ever precisely when you think you're going to die. So libido and motivo are tied to each other, energetically tied to each other. It's only when we confront death we really become alive.
Okay.
Another example is a paper I've just covered called Thoughts on War and Death by Freud, where he's talking about how European civilization was shaken in its image when World War I broke out. In other words, when World War I happened, Europe had a certain image of itself. And then as soon as people were sort of confronted with the brutal reality of what was going on in World War I, they were like, oh my God, what the hell are we? Oh my God, what are we doing? Like they were shaken to think. You know, like their illusions were shattered. I gave the example of the Fight Club example where the guy's just working at a variety store, not really thinking, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's this intense existential crisis that is what wakes you up.
That's what wakes you up to
what matters, or
So to actually confront death is to be as alive as you can while you're actually alive, and also, like Bard mentioned, for the sake of your dead friend, for example,
and to prevent you from being in silly repetitions.
Well, that's important.
That's
There's
interesting.
There's something called you can have obstacle addiction, right? So if you are a very mimetic person, then you will pick up the desires from others, right? You'll find that you will find a model that has something that you will not be able to reach, because everything that you received before is not good enough because you got it, and that means it's not good enough. So you're going to find a model that has something that you will never reach, and then you will go into an oscillation. You will go into mania. So when you think that you're going to win, when you think you're going to get that object from the model, then you go into mania, right? So you're on top of the world, and then suddenly you realize you're not going to get the model, the object. And then you go into depression. So you have these oscillations, you have these cycles of mania and depression. And that can lead, that is something that leads to self-destruction, to alcoholism, to suicide. So this is a very, very dangerous thing to end up in. And our social media, Facebook, all of these things, they strongly encourage this kind of mania, because we used to be very stratified, right? So you were competing within your own social stratum. You were competing with the other workers, or you were competing with maybe other lawyers, but now you're competing with everybody. You can be friends on Facebook with somebody who's literally 100 times richer than you, and then you see the lifestyle of that person day in, day out in your Facebook feed. So that person becomes a model that has a model obstacle. And that is one of the great problems of that is all around now. We have model obstacles everywhere. We can't keep relationships anymore. Everybody's on Tinder and stuff like that. So we make model obstacles everywhere, and we go into these manic depression cycles. And this is something that religion tries to avoid, because you get rid. So you one of the things that, so in Christianity, one of the great teachings is like, do not have idols. This is very concrete. Do not put other people in the position of an idol. Do not think that this guy who's richer than you has perfect being. That's idolatry. So that's why you need to focus on one model. You can take Jesus Christ or Buddha or Zoroaster or Mohammed or whatever. If you do that right, if you focus on that one model, it will avoid that you make models out of humans. Because if you do that, that always ends up in manic depression, mania, and depression that ends up in violence and death.
And also you get stuck in what you call the bardo, this in between life and death state, where you're neither alive nor have the courage to die
I think
correctly.
there is no bardo. Yeah. I think you just end up in the hell realm.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you end up in the hell realm, and you don't see.
You're a zombie, essentially.
Yeah, you're a zombie. You're in the you're in a.
It's the
recursive
death
loop.
drive without any life force in it. Yeah, it's just compulsive repetitive behaviors in the death drive, exactly.
Yeah, but that's
Gurdjieff called that mechanical man.
Point.
You become mechanical man.
There's no death drive. There's no drive in you that wants to die. That's a product of the mimetic process. Girard is very adamant about it. He's written whole books about this. So there's no drive to death. You don't really want to die. This is what happens if you go into mimetic escalation. You'll get there, and in the beginning you'll like it, right? In the beginning you'll think you're on top of the world, and then in the end it will become. You will.
So the death drive is a simulation.
Wait. That's not the death drive at all. Wait a second. Let's take away the Strawman argument here. That's why I said Mortido instead. It's better to say Mortido clearly. Okay. To live in the Mortido is to not even go and kill yourself. It's below killing yourself. It's below suicide. It's just that you just prolong your life with no life in it. It's a life without life. That's what Mortido is. There's not a drive. That's why
It's
death
just
drive
not a
is the better
drive,
word.
yeah.
Mortido,
Which is what you were
mortido is a
saying.
better word.
So it's essentially addiction.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Compulsive, repetitive behaviors without meaning. Yes.
It's bypassing desire and going directly to drive, essentially.
How are we going to think war today? There's a good question. From Owen. Is it Owen's question or somebody else's?
That's Owen, yeah.
Yeah. How are we going to think war today?
Well, we're surrounded by symbolic warfare all the time to begin with. So symbolic wars are everywhere because precisely like we emphasized before here, both Cadell and Thomas have talked about it, is that we have removed the old caste systems. We have removed the old subdivisions of society. We've thrown everybody into the same place, basically. And at least we pretend we have some kind of a flat society where everybody talks to everybody else, at least reacts to what everybody else is doing. And that leads to symbolic warfare. So we're essentially having, for now, tons of symbolic lynch mobs. Increasingly, symbolic lynch mobs are becoming real. People are killing themselves, which is, of course, what the feminine lynch mob is after. The feminine lynch mob doesn't kill you. The feminine lynch mob makes you kill yourself. It bullies you until you kill yourself. That's essentially what we see a lot of today, and that's what's called woke culture. And I would predict that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. So that's where war is at right now.
Women bully on the social level and men tend to bully on
we
the
have
physical
to,
level.
there's one
right?
interesting thing here. There's one interesting thing with Girard. Girard does not gender his perception. If you take Goulian, for example, who splits the brain into three brains, which is brilliant, by the way. There's the emotional brain, there's the rational brain, and there's the mimetic brain. And if they all synchronize with one another and become a tsunami, you go and kill yourself, essentially. Normally, they're supposed to be dialectical towards one another. But the thing is this, that if you look at them narratologically speaking, you discover that the rational brain is what we call logos, the emotional brain is what we call pathos, and the mimetic brain is what we call mythos. And that means the mimetic brain is actually the most feminine part of the brain, meaning that if you would gender people, allow to gender people, you would say that women are very much in the mimetic all the time, whereas men are stuck in between the rational and the emotional, meaning that men are attracted to the mimetic, whereas women are attracted to the split between the rational and emotional. If you fundamentally agree on that premise, which is essentially narratology, part of Söderqvist narratology, that means that actually mimesis, mimetic desire, is very often driven by women, and the men then hung on to it, which would explain, which we've discussed before, Thomas and Andrew and I, we discussed before, is the idea that maybe the lynch mobs of history come out of women first. They start in the square among the women during the daytime, and then they become really bloody lynch mobs at night when the women cheer on the men to go and kill the scapegoat. I think that's a very likely scenario for the vast majority of lynch mobs we're talking about here. I think paganism has a lot to do with toxic femininity as its starting point, but because the mimetic brain would actually be more feminine than the other two brains in that case.
I want to go back to this war question because I remember something Marshall McLuhan said, and he said that the only way to deal with war is dialogue. So in a way that's the only way to deal with war. In other words,
I don't think that's gonna
unless
work.
we like fight through this shit.
I know how we should deal with
this
war:
stuff.
nonviolent communication.
No,
No,
I don't think that's what he meant. I don't think that he was. That's
I'm
what
just
he meant.
joking.
I don't think it was that kind of a wishy-washy statement. It was more like that there's all these violence that we have, and we have sporting events, and so we you have to find a way to do violence properly, and that the dialogue is one way.
Wait.
Do violence.
You said properly there. That means you do sports. You don't do violence. And
Okay.
violence is never proper.
I think
it isn't violence.
If we want to approach this, continue to expand on this, what is war today question, which I think Bard handled already pretty well, and I think that syncs up nicely with what Thomas goes on about with the mimetic theory. It would be, I think more and more I'm trying to think, how can we become intelligent with the violence within us, which is currently unconscious? How can we look at ourselves, our own unconscious violence, the way we are competing with each other in symbolic warfare, and how can we become more intelligent with this very same energy? And I think that might be, the steps to what maybe I would call wisdom, and that basically turns the battle more into an inner battle, It's a battle with yourself, and potentially looking for intelligent ways to use that energy. Maybe it's martial arts. I don't know. Maybe it's sports. It's going to be different for different people. You have to find out what it is for you. But to get out of these cycles of basically symbolic warfare on social media, we have to rebel against this.
Mhm.
I can. So with Girard, Owen actually brought it up. Girard wrote a book called Battling to the End. That was his last book, and it's his most pessimistic and let's say confronting book. And he looks at the ideas of the 19th century General Clausewitz, who wrote On War, and there basically Clausewitz was on the edge between when warfare was something that that nobility did in a very organized way. So he wrote these letters to his wife like, "Oh, I'm very happy. I am riding here on my horse through this beautiful field, and it's sunny, and I'm on the way to a nice little battlefield." Right? He literally wrote that to his wife. This was just something that civilized nobility did, right? But then he also, in his book On War, he saw that it was escalating. He saw that so there was general conscription started. So instead of like professional armies led by nobility, Napoleon started using everybody. And then you had the war in Spain that was like extremely brutal beyond anything that they'd seen before. And so Clausewitz started seeing that there was some kind of there was an escalation going on, and that's where we are now, right? So we are in a apocalyptic times. That's what Girard says. So a lot of safety catches have. So we don't believe in the scapegoat mechanism anymore. You can't really, even the woke mobs or the other whatever mob, right? Nobody believes the mobs anymore. Nobody believes in the absolute guilt of the scapegoat anymore. That train has left thousands of years ago. It started with Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and it was continued with by Christianity and by Islam. So that doesn't work anymore. You cannot scapegoat people anymore and kill them in the street to pacify a community. And that's a progress, right? We're happy that doesn't happen anymore. But the problem is that the easiest way to get rid of violence is by having more violence, and we can't do that anymore. So the genie is out of the bottle. We don't have this quick and dirty solution anymore that the Romans had and that the Greek had. If everybody's fighting, let's just kill the scapegoat. We have to find another solution, and that solution is not really. There's no recipe in battling to the end. Girard,
That's why young people are killing
UFC?
themselves, right? Like young people, there's such an high amount of suicide and depression, and because
let's model obstacles. Yes.
Yeah.
If you pick a model and that model has an object that you will never get, and you obsess about that, you will kill yourself.
So if you think of the pressure cooker, we're doing all the wrong things right now. For example, we've essentially killed football hooliganism in Europe over the last 10 years. To go to a football game or a soccer game these days is dead boring. It's like families and kids are supposed to go there, when that wasn't the point with football.
Or music concerts too.
No,
yeah.
Football was ersatz war, precisely so we didn't have to go to war. So we had somewhere to let the violence out, and hooligans went out and even killed each other. That was fine. Now we're such pacifists now. Pacifism has become such a prevalent ideology. And the problem is this with feminism, when it goes radical, with feminism and pacifism, vegetarianism. These are all bad signs historically. Pacifism and vegetarianism weren't just invented around the corner. They've been around for thousands of years. But whenever they become the popular ideologies, it's all about the non-violence thing taking over. And the only thing you do when you create non-violence, you create huge pressure cookers that will explode. That's exactly what's going to happen apocalyptically with the times we live in. Because if you can't even be hooligans at a soccer game any longer, then we know for sure we're in a really bad place. Because not even the pressure cookers are just building up. Byung-Chul Han is, of course, a really interesting take on it. He says essentially that a society has a constant amount of violence, just like it has a constant amount of sex in it. And that means that if you take the violence away from the streets, it's no longer seen, it's no longer observed anywhere. It's just moved into the heads of young men who have exploding super egos because of it, which means we're going to have huge psychiatric pandemics among young men because we've tried to remove violence from our society. Violence must have a place in a society. Maybe you could contain it. I don't know. We hope for
have
that all
a-
the time, but
I have
it's
an-
constant. It's a constant.
I have an interesting story from the last few years is that for whatever reason, I found myself living with a bunch of men where the same pattern I see is men who are isolating themselves in their room with their computers and playing war games. You know, I was staying with one guy who was playing a war game like basically 18 hours a day. He would play the game for 18 hours, then go to sleep, and then would wake up, and then he would get right back on and play the war game again. Like, I don't know, does this translate in the metaverse? You know, like when we go into the metaverse, are people just going to be strapping on helmets for 18 hours a day and going into some extreme combat?
That seems to be the hope of the people who are going to create this metaverse, which is a bit bleak. But
It could be the reality.
I mean, the thing is that I think what Alexander means is that, so this is the tantric aspect, this is the Dionysian aspect. So we have to bring back all of these activities, these strong emotions, the Dionysian. And there I agree with Nietzsche. We have to bring that back, but in a way so that it is not the primitive paganism. It's not the scapegoating Dionysian. It's something else. And that is the tantric side of things. So you need to have a very strong sutra, and on top of that, you need to develop a tantric. The tantrika will not be interested in Zuckerman's metaverse.
Yeah, but tantric's kind of a rare thing. Like, how do you scale this business? I mean, if it's a society-wide problem, and tantra is a sort of elite, small elite bunch of.
No, wait. The containment of violence while allowing violence is within the sutra. Okay, then you can do tantra on top of that. Don't ever expect the majority of people to be tantric.
No, I of course.
Don't ever expect that. Tantra.
Then how do you solve the problem of mimetic violence without these models, these religious models that Thomas is speaking
I don't think
of?
you solve the problem ever. That's what pacifists believe. The problem will always be there. You just contain and minimize the damage. That's what priesthood should do at any given time in history. It's just about containing the damage done as much as possible. That's all you can ever do. Expect war to come, expect violence to occur, expect all of these things to explode. If you try to avoid it, you just put a pressure cooker on. Okay, I'm an economist by training. And the only really, really good economist I love was Hyman Minsky. And the reason why I loved Hyman Minsky was he just wrote papers, he never wrote a book. And he basically said that there's always crisis coming. And if you're trying to stop the economic crisis from coming, it's going to come back even worse. And he was, of course, proven right 2007, 2008 with the Lehman Brothers crisis. And he's probably going to be proven right again because we avoided another crisis for the past 13 years, which means if the economic crises don't come one after the other, and they wait and wait and wait, the speculative bubbles get so big that once the crisis comes, it just boom, explodes and destroys everything and leads to war, which is exactly what we try to do. It's just like, can we just blow the fuse a few more times along the way? Because if you don't blow the fuse at all, which is exactly what today's ideologies do, progressive ideologists try to do with pacifism, vegetarianism, all these things. Oh, we're gonna get rid of masculine phallic energy once and for all because it's evil, and we're gonna get it out of the way, and it will never ever rear its ugly head again. Well, it will, and it will blow up in your face soon if you try to do that. Do not build pressure cookers. That's the best. That's the best advice after Girard. Don't build pressure cookers.
So you have to read Girard with Nietzsche.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And Nietzsche is a good example of what happens when you go berserk on when you really dive into mimetic desire, right? So Owen just made the comment that Nietzsche was an extreme example of mimetic escalation. He turned Wagner into a model obstacle. Very much.
That can definitely be argued. He could also be just psychiatrically sick in general, but that's a good argument. Though Herlian has made that argument, and I think the problem with Nietzsche is that he doesn't make a distinction between the Dionysian and the Sibelian. So he falls flat with his own philosophy. He wants to be heroic and he wants to avoid victimhood, but he cannot differentiate between the heroic swarm and the victimhood mob. And that's the problem.
As Whitehead said, the fall of the devils leaves a track that is useful to understand. And I think that in the case of Nietzsche is exactly like that. You have to read Nietzsche. He's brilliant. He had brilliant ideas, but he also showed what happens when Tantra goes bad, basically. That's Nietzsche. You know, when Tantra escalates, that tantric thinking, you know, like the overman and power, will to power, and this and that. This is it's like the pathology of Tantra. This is what happens when you do Tantra without sutra.
Well, maybe his obsession with Christianity turned him into the crucified one.
Yeah,
No,
in the
no,
end,
no,
he was
that's
saying,
just
Instead of
too
the end of his
vulgar.
life.
Andrew,
yeah,
Andrew,
he
no,
turned
no,
Jesus.
Why no?
no, stop it.
Why not?
Yes.
No,
Yes.
but to use the vocabulary we used before tonight, Nietzsche is the oscillation without the negation. Why do you think Cadell and I are working with Hegel and Nietzsche? Okay, why is Hegel the philosopher of negation? Without Hegel, you get exactly what Thomas just described with Nietzsche. I think what's lacking in Nietzsche is Hegel. What is lacking is the understanding of the fundamental negation, which is precisely why Nietzsche cannot make the move from the old paradigm to the new paradigm. He ends up in the idea of the isolated, atomistic, aristocratic individual as his idea. He ends up as a vulgar Cartesian, for God's sake. That's not the way of the future. We cannot build the future on Nietzsche at all because he doesn't have negation in his worship of the oscillation. And therefore, he cannot differentiate between the positive and the negative oscillation, I mean, the good or the bad oscillation, meaning that he cannot differentiate between the Dionysian and the Sibelian, which must be done. You must tell that occasionally a mob can be a swarm. Most of the time, a mob is a mob.
I want to hear from
Assume
Cadell
that.
because you haven't spoken for a few minutes, Cadell. And we only have a couple more minutes left in our allotted time. We could go a few minutes over. It's fine with me. But
I would just say so I'll try and relate to both what Thomas said and what Bard said as much as I can in a short amount of time. I agree that it's really interesting to read Girard with Nietzsche, and I really think it's in particular more and more interesting for me to think about the relationship between Freud and Girard, where Freud is sort of a model of psychoanalysis, and Girard is potentially a model of Girard. Girard is possibly a model for anthropology. So I think that for anyone out there who's looking to read about both psychology and anthropology, those are the directions I would point. And the reason why and what unifies them is the way they approach the pathic mind and violence and killing and death, and they're really getting into the human mind and what we are. And I think a real philosophy can be built out of that, you know, a philosophy that's in touch with the human mind. And then in relationship to what Bard said, everything he said about the relationship between Nietzsche and Hegel is exactly what we're working on. It's exactly the direction we're trying to think. And it's basically, yes, there is absolute gold in Nietzsche. If you really work through Thus That Spoke Zarathustra, there's so many cool ideas in there. It's unbelievable. It's a gold mine. But he is not the basis for a paradigmatics. And the last thing I'll say is that in my talk yesterday at the Stoa, I did a presentation on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit and the foreword. And one of the arguments I made in that presentation was that almost all of philosophy in the last 200 years has been a cheap and childish reaction against Hegel. And I think Nietzsche falls into that camp. There are so many post-Hegelian philosophers that wanted to differentiate themselves from Daddy. And as a consequence of trying to differentiate themselves from Daddy, they just make a big childish mess of their philosophy. It's not a real paradigmatics. So in conclusion, if you want to get into philosophy, I would recommend reading Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. If you want to get into understanding psychology, read Freud. If you want to get into anthropology, read Girard. And I think those are some of the major thinkers we're playing with, if we could bring us together. Where my frontier of my mind is really thinking our own violence. And what do we do with it? What do we transform it with? I like the concept of sublimation. Maybe that's a topic for a different podcast.
okay,
Sounds like a good conclusion.
sounds like a nice final sermon of some kind, or cool, excellent.
Amen.
Amen. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord.
Yeah.
Um,
Die again, die better.
die again, die better.
Praise the Lord, it does
Check
not
out
exist.
Catalyst. Die again, die better. Okay, and Alexander Bard. And anyway, so thank you everybody for, as usual, an extraordinarily rich and maddening and beautiful conversation. And I hope we can do it again sometime. And thank you everybody for being here in the audience.